6 drops of blood hit the hospital floor before anyone realized the man on the gurney was not just wounded. He was dangerous. 20 doctors surrounded him at Mercy General Emergency Room that night. 20 highly trained medical professionals. Every single one of them backed away when he opened his eyes. Not because he was violent, because his training ran deeper than their protocols. He was a Navy SEAL sniper, bleeding out from an injury that should not exist. A wound pattern so precise, it looked surgical. So deliberate, it whispered betrayal. Security could not restrain him. Sedatives would not touch him. He was seconds from crawling off that bed and disappearing into the Virginia night, taking his secrets with him. Then the smallest nurse in the room stepped forward, the one everyone overlooked, the one who had been invisible for 8 years. She leaned close and whispered 6 syllables that stopped a war. A call sign that officially died in Kandahar. A name that belonged to a ghost. What you are about to witness is not just a medical emergency. It is the unraveling of 8 years of silence. The collision between a past that refuses to stay buried and a present that demands the truth. This is the story of what happens when the people we send to war come home only to discover the real enemy was always wearing the same uniform. Drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. Because what happened in that emergency room will change how you see every soldier who ever told you they were fine. The truth about Sarah Mitchell began 6 months before that blood hit the floor. She arrived at Mercy General Hospital on a Tuesday morning in March, carrying a single duffel bag and a resume so unremarkable it practically begged not to be remembered. The Human Resources Director barely glanced at her credentials. Licensed registered nurse, 3 years experience in general medical settings, clean background check, no red flags, no distinguishing characteristics. Exactly the kind of hire that fills overnight shifts without complaint or drama. She was assigned to the emergency department night rotation and given a locker in the staff changing room that smelled like industrial cleaner and the accumulated exhaustion of every nurse who had used it before her. Sarah unpacked her bag with the efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that possessions were anchors that slowed you down when you needed to move fast. 2 extra pairs of scrubs, a toiletry kit containing the minimum required for basic hygiene, a protein bar that she would forget to eat for weeks. No photographs, no mementos, nothing that would invite questions about where she came from or who she used to be. The other nurses noticed this absence the way people notice empty spaces on walls where pictures should hang. They assumed she was private, maybe recently divorced, possibly running from something personal and ordinary, like a bad relationship or family conflict. None of them guessed that what she was running from had body counts and classification levels that made it illegal to discuss even in therapy. Her first shift set the pattern for every shift that followed. She arrived 15 minutes early, reviewed patient charts with meticulous attention to detail, responded to calls with calm efficiency that never escalated into urgency, even when situations demanded it. She performed her duties exactly as protocol dictated. No more, no less. When other nurses gathered in the break room to decompress between emergencies, Sarah filled out paperwork or restocked supply carts. When colleagues invited her to after-shift drinks, she declined with polite consistency that eventually stopped generating invitations. Within 3 weeks, the ER staff had categorized her as competent but strange, reliable but distant, the kind of person who would always show up for her shift, but never really be present in the way that builds camaraderie. Nurse Jenkins, a veteran of 15 years in emergency medicine, made it her mission to crack through Sarah's walls. She tried casual conversation about weekend plans. Sarah said she preferred quiet time at home. She asked about family. Sarah mentioned that her parents had passed and changed the subject before follow-up questions could form. She invited Sarah to a birthday celebration for one of the residents. Sarah sent a card and a gift, but did not attend. After 2 months of gentle persistence meeting consistent deflection, Jenkins gave up with the resigned acceptance of someone who had encountered emotional unavailability often enough to recognize when it was structural rather than temporary. The other nurses developed theories. Brady thought Sarah was former military based on the way she kept her locker organized and her posture when standing still. Chen speculated about witness protection because who moves to Virginia Beach without any apparent connections or history? Williams suggested autism spectrum because of her difficulty with social cues and preference for routine. They were all partially right and completely wrong. Sarah was not hiding from the law or struggling with neurodivergence. She was simply practicing the survival skills she had learned in the 8 years since Kandahar. Invisibility as a lifestyle, anonymity as armor, the complete erasure of anything that might draw attention or trigger memory or create the kinds of connections that led to questions she could not answer without breaking federal law. Her apartment reflected the same deliberate emptiness as her locker. Studio unit in a complex populated mostly by seasonal workers and military families rotating through temporary assignments. Furniture from discount stores. Walls bare except for a calendar marking her work schedule. Kitchen stocked with shelf-stable foods that required minimal preparation. No television. No social media presence. No subscriptions to newspapers or magazines. She had learned that the quieter your life appeared on paper, the less interesting you became to the kinds of people who monitored for patterns of behavior that suggested someone was more than they claimed to be. The only exception to her ruthless minimalism sat in a locked drawer beneath clothes she never wore. A set of dog tags. Unit insignia. Discharge papers that listed her separation as honorable and routine when the reality had been anything but. A single photograph of 12 people in combat gear standing in front of a helicopter that she knew for a fact had been destroyed 3 days after the picture was taken. She told herself she kept these items as a reminder of what she had walked away from. The truth was, she kept them because throwing them away felt like erasing the only proof that the person she used to be had actually existed. Sarah's strategy for maintaining invisibility required constant vigilance. She varied her route to work, paid for everything in cash when possible, used a post office box for mail instead of her apartment address, listed no emergency contact on hospital forms because putting down a name meant explaining relationships, and relationships meant history, and history led to questions. She attended no veteran support groups despite the hospital's wellness program, encouraging staff to access mental health resources. She did not apply for VA benefits even though she qualified. She avoided restaurants and stores that offered military discounts because presenting identification meant creating a record of her presence in databases that might be monitored by people who believed she should not exist. The irony was not lost on her that she had survived combat situations designed to kill her, only to spend years afterward living like someone already dead. But survival took many forms. In Kandahar, it meant staying alert for threats that announced themselves with gunfire and explosives. In Virginia Beach, it meant staying boring enough that no one looked too closely at the gaps in her story, or the skills she carefully never demonstrated beyond what civilian nursing required. She almost succeeded in disappearing completely, almost convinced herself that Sarah Mitchell, the night shift nurse, was her actual identity, and Petty Officer Mitchell call sign Raven was someone who had died in a stairwell along with the teammates she could not save. Almost believed that she could live out the rest of her life, treating patients and filling charts and going home to an empty apartment where no one asked her to remember things she had spent 8 years trying to forget. Then Connor Hayes crashed through the automatic doors, trailing blood, and everything Sarah had built to protect herself shattered like glass under pressure. It was never designed to withstand. The night started unremarkably. Thursday evening, early June, temperature hovering in the low 80s with humidity that made scrubs stick to skin before shifts even officially began. Sarah arrived at 7:45 for her 8 o'clock start time, changed into fresh scrubs in the locker room while Brady complained about a patient in Bay 3 who kept pulling out his IV line, and Williams shared gossip about the new attending physician who apparently had a reputation at his previous hospital for sleeping with residents. Sarah listened without contributing. nodded in appropriate places, left the locker room while they were still talking. The ER had the controlled chaos energy of a busy night building toward critical mass. Car accident victims in trauma bays 1 and 2. Elderly patient with chest pain in 4. Pediatric case presenting with possible meningitis symptoms in the isolation room. Sarah checked her assignments and began her rounds with the systematic efficiency that made her valuable to charge nurses who needed someone reliable for the difficult cases that required patience more than heroism. At 8:14, her pager buzzed with the code that meant incoming trauma. She glanced at the message. Adult male. Significant blood loss. Possible blast injuries. ETA 3 minutes. The terminology triggered something deep in her muscle memory, but she pushed it down. Blast injuries happened in construction accidents and gas explosions. This was Virginia Beach, not Kandahar. She continued her current task of updating medication charts while half her attention monitored the ambulance bay. The paramedics hit the doors at exactly 8:14 and 17 seconds. Sarah knew because she happened to be looking at the wall clock when the automatic doors slammed open with enough force to make several people turn and stare. The gurney came through fast. Too fast for standard transport protocols. The kind of speed that meant someone in the ambulance had made the calculation that seconds mattered more than smooth handling. Blood dripped from the gurney frame. Not pooled, not sprayed. Dripping in a steady pattern that spoke to venous bleeding significant enough to require immediate intervention, but not so catastrophic that the patient had already exsanguinated during transport. Sarah set down her tablet and moved toward the trauma bay. Not running, not with the urgency that would draw attention, just repositioning herself to observe while maintaining the appearance of casual interest. 20 doctors and nurses converged on the patient. She counted them automatically. Old habit from triage situations where knowing how many hands were available determined who got assigned which tasks. The patient was male, early 30s, athletic build visible even under the trauma blanket and cutaway clothing. His right side was wrapped in field dressings that had soaked through multiple layers. Military-grade compression bandages. Not civilian first aid. The head paramedic was giving report to Dr. Mitchell, the attending physician. Found on a rooftop. No witnesses. Called it in himself before losing consciousness. Vitals unstable during transport. The story had gaps large enough to drive questions through, but nobody was asking them yet because the immediate crisis of keeping someone alive took precedence over investigating how they got injured. Sarah watched from the supply station, 20 feet away. She was stocking gauze that did not need restocking, but the task gave her reason to be present without being involved. The patient came awake suddenly. Not the gradual return to consciousness that follows anesthesia or deep sleep. The instant tactical awareness of someone whose training overrode unconsciousness when threat assessment became necessary. His eyes opened already scanning, calculating, looking for exits and weapons and determining whether the people surrounding him were friendly or hostile. 20 medical professionals froze. This was not normal patient behavior. This was something else. Something that made seasoned emergency physicians take involuntary steps backward because the look in this man's eyes said he was capable of violence and currently deciding whether to deploy it. Sarah's heart rate dropped into the steady rhythm she had not felt in 8 years. The physiological response to combat proximity. Her hands continued their task of organizing gauze packages, but her focus narrowed to the man on the gurney with a precision that had nothing to do with nursing and everything to do with recognition. She knew that look, had worn that look. The expression of someone whose body was in a civilian hospital, but whose mind was still in a war zone where letting your guard down meant dying. The patient ripped his oxygen mask away, grabbed the nearest doctor's wrist with enough force to make the man gasp. His voice, when he spoke, carried command authority that had nothing to do with his current status as someone bleeding heavily enough to be in immediate danger. Do not touch me. Not a request. Not a plea. an order delivered with absolute certainty that compliance was expected. Security officers appeared in the doorway, radiating uncertainty. They were trained for psychiatric patients and violent drunks, not for whatever this was, not for someone who looked like he could disable all of them before they finished reaching for their restraints. Dr. Mitchell tried negotiation. "Sir, you are in a hospital. You are safe. We need to treat your injuries." The patient's response was to kick hard enough that the gurney slammed into the wall with a sound that made everyone flinch. His words came out measured and deadly calm. "You strap me down, and I am gone. I will crawl out of here bleeding." Sarah believed him. She could see in his posture and his breathing and the way his muscles coiled that he had already calculated the distance to the exit and determined he could make it even injured. Probably had made similar calculations in worse conditions. The standoff stretched. 20 medical professionals and one patient locked in a stalemate, where protocol said to restrain and sedate, but instinct said that trying to do so would escalate the situation into something nobody was trained to handle. Sarah watched Dr. Mitchell's face cycle through options, watched the security officers grip their equipment, watched the patient's breathing accelerate into a pattern she recognized as panic response, masked by aggression. She set down the gauze, stepped away from the supply station, moved toward the trauma bay with footsteps that were quiet and deliberate. Several nurses turned to look at her with expressions ranging from confusion to concern. Sarah Mitchell did not insert herself into situations. Sarah Mitchell stayed on the periphery and handled tasks that did not require interaction. What she was doing now contradicted 6 months of established behavior. Dr. Chen, a resident who had worked several shifts with Sarah, moved to intercept her. "Mitchell, this is not your case. Step back." Sarah did not acknowledge him, did not slow her pace, just continued walking toward the bed where a man was seconds away from doing something that would get him hurt worse or killed. She knew because she had been in similar situations, had watched operators in medical facilities fight against help because their training would not allow them to accept vulnerability in unsecured locations with unknown personnel. The patient tracked her approach, his eyes locked on her with the intensity of someone conducting threat assessment. She stopped 3 feet from the bed, close enough to establish presence, far enough to respect his defensive perimeter. His breathing was rapid and shallow, 32 breaths per minute, intercostal muscles showing strain. She cataloged the symptoms automatically. Tension pneumothorax developing. The lung was collapsing. He had maybe 15 minutes before the injury transitioned from critical to fatal. But saying that out loud would mean explaining how she knew, would mean revealing training that civilian nurses did not possess. She leaned in, close enough that only he could hear, close enough that her next words would reach him without reaching the audience of witnesses watching, with varying degrees of confusion and concern. She spoke 6 syllables that she had not allowed herself to think about in 8 years. 6 syllables that officially did not exist in any record that was not classified above top secret. 6 syllables that confirmed she was not just a nurse who happened to know military terminology. She was one of them. Shadow 1 actual. His entire body went still. Not relaxed, not surrendered. Just absolutely motionless in the way that only people with extensive combat training could achieve. His breath caught. His pupils dilated. Recognition hit him like a physical blow. When he spoke, his voice carried disbelief and something that sounded almost like grief. That call sign died in Kandahar 8 years ago. With everyone who knew it, Sarah held his gaze, allowed herself one moment of complete honesty. So did I. The emergency room did not exhale. 20 pairs of eyes remained locked on the tableau at the center of Trauma Bay 2. A dying man who had stopped fighting. A quiet nurse who had just spoken words that made no sense to anyone except the patient. The monitors continued their insistent beeping. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with mechanical indifference, but the atmosphere had shifted into something nobody could name. Something that felt less like a medical emergency and more like a classified briefing accidentally conducted in public. Connor. Hayes stared at Sarah with an expression that cycled through shock, confusion, and finally settled on something approaching wonder. "You cannot be here," he said. His voice was barely audible beneath the oxygen mask he had stopped fighting. "They told me extraction was total loss. No survivors." Sarah did not respond immediately. She was already moving her hands across his torso with practiced efficiency that had nothing to do with the gentle assessment techniques taught in nursing school. Her fingers found the edges of the field dressing, felt the heat radiating from inflamed tissue, noted the subtle asymmetry in his chest movement that confirmed what she had suspected from 20 feet away. "Your left lung is collapsing," she said. Her tone was clinical, matter of fact. The voice she had used in tactical situations where panic served no purpose, and clarity meant the difference between saving someone and watching them die. "You have maybe 12 minutes before it becomes irreversible." Connor tried to sit up. Pain stopped him halfway. Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. Gentle, but immovable. "Do not move. Movement increases intrathoracic pressure, makes it worse." Dr. Mitchell found his voice. "Nurse Mitchell, what are you doing?" His question carried the weight of authority trying to reassert itself over a situation that had spiraled beyond normal hierarchy. Sarah did not look at him. She was counting respirations, watching the subtle flutter of Connor's intercostal muscles, reading his body the way she had been trained to read soldiers who could not or would not accurately report their own status because admitting weakness felt like failure. "I am assessing for tension pneumothorax," Sarah said. Her hands moved to Connor's neck, felt for tracheal deviation, found it. The windpipe had shifted slightly to the right. "Textbook presentation." She looked up at Dr. Mitchell. "He needs immediate needle decompression. We do not have time for imaging confirmation." The attending physician hesitated. Protocol required chest X-ray before performing such an invasive procedure. Protocol existed to prevent mistakes that could kill patients if diagnosis was wrong. But the nurse staring at him with absolute certainty in her eyes was not suggesting. She was telling him with the confidence of someone who had made this call before, under circumstances where being wrong meant body bags. "How do you know?" Dr. Chen asked. The resident's voice carried genuine curiosity rather than challenge. Sarah's jaw tightened. The question had answers she could not give without explaining training that civilian nurses did not receive, without admitting to experience that came from war zones rather than hospital rotations. She made a choice in that split second. Told a truth that was incomplete, but accurate enough to satisfy immediate scrutiny. "I have seen this presentation before," she said. "The progression is predictable. If we wait for imaging, we will be performing this procedure on a patient in cardiac arrest instead of a patient who is still compensating." Dr. Mitchell looked at Connor, looked at the monitors showing oxygen saturation dropping despite supplemental oxygen, looked at Sarah's hands, positioned with the kind of precision that suggested she had already mentally mapped the exact placement for needle insertion. He made the decision that would define the rest of his night and possibly his career. "Do it," he said. "But if you are wrong," Sarah cut him off. "If I am wrong, you can fire me and report me to the nursing board, and I will accept full responsibility. But I am not wrong." She held out her hand. "Someone give me a 14-gauge needle and a 10-milliliter syringe." Nurse Jenkins moved before conscious thought could override instinct. She grabbed the chest decompression kit from the crash cart and handed it to Sarah. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Jenkins saw something in Sarah's expression that confirmed every suspicion she had harbored for 6 months about the quiet nurse who never quite fit the pattern of someone running from ordinary problems. Sarah broke the sterile packaging with movements that were economical and precise. No wasted motion, no hesitation. She positioned herself at Connor's right side, palpated the space between his 4th and 5th ribs, found the intercostal gap with fingertips that remembered this anatomy from repetition under conditions where lighting was poor and time was measured in heartbeats. She looked at Connor. He was watching her with eyes that were starting to glaze from hypoxia. "Stay with me," she said, "on my count." Connor's voice was weak but steady. "No, on yours. I follow your voice." The statement carried layers of meaning that nobody in the room except Sarah understood. She had led him before, through smoke and gunfire, and a stairwell that was collapsing while enemy combatants closed in from 3 directions. He had followed her voice then because it was the only thing that cut through the chaos and told him where to go to survive. 8 years later, in a hospital in Virginia Beach, he was following that same voice for the same reason. Because when everything else failed, operators trusted the medic who had kept them breathing when the mission went sideways. Sarah inserted the needle with a smooth, continuous motion, felt the resistance of skin muscle pleura, then the sudden give as the tip entered the pleural space. A rush of trapped air hissed out under pressure. The sound was distinctive, unmistakable. Confirmation that diagnosis was correct and intervention was necessary, and she had just performed a battlefield procedure in a civilian emergency room while 20 people watched. Connor's oxygen saturation climbed. 91, 93, 95. His breathing eased from desperate to merely labored. Color returned to his lips. The monitors stopped screaming and settled into urgent but stable ranges. Sarah withdrew the needle and applied sterile dressing over the insertion site. Her hands were rock steady. No tremor, no sign of the adrenaline that was certainly flooding her system. She had learned long ago how to control physiological responses that betrayed fear or excitement or anything else that might be interpreted as lack of confidence in high-stakes situations. She stepped back from the bed, let the other medical staff take over with establishing chest tube and securing the airway and all the follow-up procedures that would stabilize Connor for transport to surgery. She walked toward the supply station where she had been standing before, inserting herself into a case that was not her assignment. Her legs felt distant. Her hands started to shake now that the immediate crisis was past. She gripped the edge of the counter and forced them still through sheer will. Nurse Jenkins appeared beside her. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, not accusatory, genuinely curious. Sarah did not answer immediately. She was watching Connor through the glass partition, watching the chest tube go in, watching him breathe with both lungs now that the pressure had been relieved, watching him survive something that would have killed him if she had stayed invisible and let protocol take precedence over experience. "I used to work in a different kind of medicine," Sarah finally said. "Before I came here." Jenkins waited for elaboration. When none came, she tried a different approach. That was not civilian technique. That was combat medicine. Sarah turned to look at her, considered lying, decided that after what just happened, lying was pointless. "Yes," she said. It was. The admission hung in the air between them. Jenkins processed the implications. The quiet nurse who avoided social interaction and never talked about her past had just revealed training that came from war zones, which meant military service, which meant the kind of experiences that explained why she kept her distance and controlled her environment and lived like someone who had learned that letting people get close created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. Jenkins opened her mouth to ask the next logical question. Sarah spoke before she could form the words. "Please do not ask me anything else. I cannot tell you more. Cannot is different from will not." Jenkins understood the distinction. Cannot implied legal restrictions rather than personal preference, which meant classified service, which meant Sarah Mitchell was not just former military. She was former something that required non-disclosure agreements and security clearances, and the kind of separation from normal life that left people fundamentally changed. "I will not ask," Jenkins said. "But you should know that everyone saw what you just did. They are going to have questions." Sarah nodded. She knew. 6 months of invisibility destroyed in less than 60 seconds. The cost of choosing to save Connor's life instead of protecting her anonymity. She had known the price when she stepped forward, had made the calculation and decided that some things mattered more than staying hidden. She was living with that choice now, would continue living with it when the questions came, when the scrutiny increased, when the people who had been watching her from a distance for 8 years realized she had surfaced. Through the glass partition of the trauma bay, Sarah saw something that made her blood run cold. 2 men in dark suits standing in the corridor. They were not hospital security, not police, not family members waiting for news. They stood with the kind of professional stillness that came from surveillance training. Hands clasped loosely in front of them, eyes tracking movement throughout the ER with systematic precision. Earpieces barely visible beneath short haircuts that screamed federal employment. Sarah's pulse elevated, but she kept her breathing controlled, made no sudden movements that would signal recognition or alarm. She turned back to the supply cart and continued restocking with hands that wanted to shake, but did not, because she had learned how to maintain composure under observation. The suits were here, which meant someone had been monitoring emergency room admissions, waiting for exactly this scenario. A combat injury showing up in a civilian hospital. A pattern that might draw out assets who were supposed to be retired, or dead, or disappeared into lives so quiet they would never surface. Connor saw them too. She watched his eyes track to the window, watched his jaw tighten. He knew what their presence meant. This was not random. This was not coincidence. His injury, his arrival at Mercy General on a night when Sarah was working. The timing was too precise, the circumstances too convenient. Someone had orchestrated this, used him as bait to see if Sarah Mitchell would break cover when faced with a fellow operator bleeding out. Dr. Chen approached the supply station. His expression was complicated. Respect mixed with confusion, mixed with the beginning of fear, because he was smart enough to recognize that what just happened in his ER had implications beyond medical crisis management. "That was incredible," he said. "Where did you train?" Sarah gave him the answer she had prepared 8 years ago for exactly this kind of question. "I did a rotation in a trauma center that handled a lot of penetrating injuries. Learned some advanced techniques." The lie was smooth, practiced, completely plausible, also completely insufficient for anyone who had actually watched her work. "That was not trauma center technique," Chen said. "That was military, special operations level." Sarah met his eyes, decided that partial truth was safer than complete denial. "I used to be a Navy medic," she said, "before nursing school. Long time ago." Chen nodded slowly. "How long ago?" Sarah considered her answer. "Long enough that I hoped I would never need those skills again." The trauma bay door opened. Dr. Mitchell stepped out. His expression was unreadable, professional mask firmly in place, but his eyes carried questions that would need answers eventually. "Nurse Mitchell," he said. "I need to see you in my office." Sarah glanced at Connor. His vitals were stable. The chest tube was functioning. He was being prepped for transfer to the OR for surgical exploration and repair. He would survive. She had bought him that. Whatever consequences followed were prices she would pay for keeping him alive. She followed Dr. Mitchell down the corridor past the 2 men in suits who did not acknowledge her presence, but tracked her movement with peripheral vision that was too precise to be casual. The office was small, cramped, filled with paperwork and the accumulated weight of too many shifts managing chaos with insufficient resources. Dr. Mitchell closed the door, gestured to a chair. Sarah remained standing. Force of habit. Never sit when you might need to move quickly. "I need to understand what just happened out there," Dr. Mitchell said. His tone was careful, not angry, not accusatory, just deeply uncertain about whether he had witnessed exceptional medical judgment or a massive violation of protocol that happened to work out. Sarah chose her words carefully. "I assessed the patient. made a clinical decision based on presentation and vital signs, performed a procedure I was trained to do. He survived. That is what happened. Dr. Mitchell shook his head. That is the technical description. I am asking about the rest of it. The way that patient responded to you. The call sign or whatever it was. The fact that you just performed a procedure that most emergency physicians would hesitate to do without imaging confirmation. The way those men in suits showed up 30 seconds after the ambulance arrived. This is not standard. This is something else. Sarah remained silent. She could not explain without revealing information that was classified. Could not defend her actions without admitting to a past that was supposed to be erased. Could not tell the truth without breaking laws that carried prison sentences. Dr. Mitchell waited. When she did not speak, he tried a different approach. "Are you in danger?" he asked. The question surprised her. She had expected interrogation about credentials or demands for explanation of technique, not concern for her personal safety. "No," she said, then reconsidered. "Not immediate danger." Dr. Mitchell leaned back in his chair. "But danger." Sarah nodded fractionally, the kind that comes from being visible when you have spent 8 years trying to be invisible. He absorbed that, seemed to understand that he was touching edges of something much larger than a single patient case. "I am not going to report this," he said. "What you did saved that man's life. I watched it happen. Whatever else is going in that matters more than protocol." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. Relief she had not expected. "Thank you," she said. Dr. Mitchell held up a hand, but he continued. "I need you to understand that those men are still out there. They are waiting for something, and when they make their move, I cannot protect you from whatever this is. I can only make sure that your medical actions tonight are documented as appropriate response to life-threatening emergency. The rest is on you." She understood. He was drawing a boundary, supporting her professional competence while acknowledging that the situation extended beyond his authority or ability to intervene. It was more than she had right to expect, more than many administrators would offer. She thanked him again and left the office. The corridor was empty. The suits had moved. Sarah returned to the trauma bay, where Connor was being loaded onto a transport gurney for transfer to OR. She approached under the pretense of checking his chart, leaned close while adjusting his oxygen line. "They used you to find me," she whispered. Connor's eyes confirmed what she already suspected. His voice was weak but clear. "I know. I am sorry." Sarah shook her head. "Not your fault. You did not ask to be bait." Connor's hand shot out, gripped her wrist with surprising strength for someone who had nearly died. "The coordinates were leaked," he said. "My position was eyes-only encrypted. Same security level as Kandahar. Same impossible breach." Sarah went very still, felt ice settle in her stomach. The same signature, the same deliberate compromise. Someone inside the chain of command selling classified intelligence. Not 8 years ago. Now. Still. How many others, she asked. Connor's expression was bleak. "I was investigating supply chain irregularities before this happened. Found at least 7 cases in 18 months. Operators compromised. Missions burned. Some killed. Some injured like me. All of it attributed to enemy action. All of it actually internal betrayal." Sarah closed her eyes. 7 confirmed cases. How many more that were never investigated because the official story was accepted without question? How many families told their soldier died heroically when the truth was, they died because someone with access and authority decided they were inconvenient? The transport team signaled they were ready to move Connor to surgery. Sarah stepped back, let them wheel him away, watched until the gurney disappeared around the corner. Then she turned and walked directly toward the 2 men in suits who had repositioned themselves near the nurse station. She stopped 3 feet away, close enough to make her intention clear, far enough to maintain the appearance of professional distance. I know why you are here, she said. Her voice was low enough not to carry, but clear enough that they could not pretend they had not heard. The taller of the two men raised an eyebrow. Is that right? Sarah held his gaze. You have been waiting for me to surface, used him to make it happen, calculated his injury severity to ensure he survived transport, but required immediate intervention. Knew I work nights at this hospital. Knew I would not be able to ignore a fellow operator in distress. You turned him into bait, and you got what you wanted. Confirmation that I still exist. The second man smiled. It was not a friendly expression. You are making assumptions, he said. Sarah shook her head. I am stating facts. And here is another fact. 20 people saw what happened in that trauma bay. Saw me save his life. Saw him recognize me. Saw you show up immediately after. Whatever you are planning, understand that I am no longer invisible. Too many witnesses. Too many questions that will follow if anything happens to me or him. The taller man stepped closer, lowered his voice. You signed agreements, Petty Officer Mitchell. Those agreements remain in force regardless of circumstances. Sarah allowed herself a cold smile. I saved a patient using skills I am legally certified to perform. If those skills came from military training, that is not a violation. That is qualifications. Unless you want to argue that saving lives is somehow classified information. The standoff lasted 3 heartbeats. Then a new voice cut through the tension. That is enough. Sarah turned. A third man approached, older, silver hair, expensive suit that fit too well to be government issue. She recognized him immediately despite 8 years and the gray that had replaced brown at his temples. Operative Handler James Garrett, Division 7. The man who signed her discharge papers. The man who promised she could disappear if she stayed silent. The man whose presence here meant the promise was always conditional and the conditions had just expired. Garrett stopped beside his associates, dismissed them with a gesture that sent them moving toward the exit. He studied Sarah with eyes that cataloged changes the way a handler catalogs assets for operational readiness. You look well, he said. Civilian life suits you. Sarah did not respond to the observation, waited for him to state his actual purpose. Garrett continued. We need to talk. Not here. Not with audience. There is a consultation room. Private. We can discuss the situation and determine how to proceed in a way that protects everyone's interests. Sarah knew this was not a request. Knew that refusing would escalate the situation in ways she was not prepared to handle, surrounded by colleagues and patients. She also knew that going with Garrett meant stepping into a conversation where she had minimal leverage and maximum vulnerability. But she had already made her choice when she answered Connor's call sign. Had accepted that surfacing would bring consequences. She just needed to control those consequences enough to keep Connor alive and herself free. Everything else was negotiable. She followed Garrett to the family consultation room. The space was designed for delivering bad news to relatives. Soft lighting meant to be comforting. Tissue boxes positioned strategically. Chairs arranged to facilitate difficult conversations. Garrett closed the door. Did not sit. Stood with his back to the window so that Sarah had to face the light if she wanted to maintain eye contact. Tactical positioning. Making her work harder to read his expressions while he could see hers clearly. You used a classified call sign in a civilian facility, Garrett said without preamble. Compromised operational security. Revealed your continued viability to witnesses who will ask questions. That constitutes multiple violations of your separation agreement. Sarah kept her hands relaxed at her sides. I responded to a medical emergency using information necessary to establish patient trust and ensure compliance with treatment. Nothing I said revealed operational details or ongoing missions. My separation agreement prohibits disclosure of classified information. A call sign from a mission that officially never happened cannot be classified because acknowledging its classification would require admitting the mission existed. Garrett's expression did not change, but something shifted in his posture. Subtle recognition that she had spent 8 years thinking about exactly this scenario, preparing arguments, identifying legal gray areas that could be exploited. She was not the traumatized medic who walked away from Kandahar, broken and desperate for escape. She was someone who had used 8 years of quiet to become dangerous in different ways. The wound pattern on Connor Hayes, Sarah continued. Shaped charge, directional explosive, designed to wound, not kill. Same signature as the injuries my teammates sustained in Kandahar. Same impossible intelligence that allowed precise targeting of classified positions. You want to talk about violations? Let us talk about how many operators have been deliberately injured or killed to protect whatever corruption you are running. Let us talk about families lied to, reports falsified, evidence classified to prevent scrutiny. Garrett moved then, fast enough to close distance, controlled enough not to seem threatening. He stopped inches from Sarah's face. You are making very serious accusations, he said. His voice was quiet, deadly calm. The kind of tone that preceded violence or legal destruction, or both. Sarah did not back down, did not blink, held her ground because retreating now would signal weakness, and weakness invited exploitation. I am making observations based on pattern analysis, she said. Observations I have been documenting for 8 years. Dates, locations, names, injury reports that do not match official narratives. Alone, each incident looks like fog of war. Together, they tell a different story. Garrett's eyes narrowed. What have you done? Sarah smiled. The expression was cold, professional. The look of someone who had just revealed they were holding cards their opponent did not know existed. I have insurance, she said. Files distributed to multiple secure locations. Dead man switches set to trigger if I miss weekly check-ins. You cannot disappear me without releasing everything I know. You cannot discredit me without drawing attention to why you are trying. Your only option is to leave me alone and hope I never have reason to make those files public. The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of the ER continuing its work beyond the closed door. Garrett studied her face, searching for bluff, finding only certainty backed by 8 years of preparation. Finally, he stepped back. This conversation is not over, he said. We will be watching. Any further violations, any hint that you are sharing information, we will move decisively. Sarah nodded. I understand. Just as you understand that decisive moves against me trigger automatic release, mutually assured destruction. You taught me that concept. Seems appropriate to apply it here. Garrett left without further comment. Sarah remained in the consultation room for 60 seconds. Counted her heartbeats. Let the adrenaline metabolize. Then she returned to the ER where her shift continued as if the last hour had not fundamentally altered the trajectory of multiple lives, including her own. Sarah's shift ended at 6 in the morning, but she did not leave the hospital until nearly 7. The ER overnight had been relentlessly busy after Connor's departure. 3 motor vehicle accidents, a stabbing victim who coded twice before surgical teams stabilized him, an elderly woman with stroke symptoms who needed immediate transport to the neurological center across town. Sarah moved through each case with the mechanical efficiency of someone operating on muscle memory, while her conscious mind processed events that had nothing to do with the patients in front of her. Nurse Jenkins watched her with increased attention throughout the remaining hours. Not suspicious exactly, more like someone reassessing a colleague they thought they understood and discovering layers they had missed. During a brief lull around 4 in the morning, Jenkins brought coffee to the nurse station where Sarah was updating charts. You do not have to tell me anything, Jenkins said. But I want you to know that what you did tonight was extraordinary. Whatever else is happening, you saved that man's life when the rest of us were still trying to figure out what was wrong. That matters. Sarah accepted the coffee with a nod of acknowledgement. Wondered how many of her colleagues were having similar thoughts. How many would approach her with questions or respect or suspicion disguised as concern? She had spent 6 months becoming invisible. One night had made her the most visible person in the department. The irony was sharp enough to taste. By the time she reached her car in the employee parking lot, exhaustion had settled into her bones with the weight of something more than physical fatigue. She sat behind the wheel without starting the engine, let her head rest against the seat, closed her eyes and saw Connor's face when he recognized her call sign, saw the blood dripping from the gurney, saw Garrett's expression when she told him about the insurance files. All of it replaying with the persistence of memories that would not be dismissed simply because she was tired. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her answer. Connor's voice came through rough with pain medication, but alert enough to be functional. "They are keeping me isolated," he said. "Medical observation floor. No visitors except cleared personnel. I convinced the nurse I needed to make emergency contact calls for record keeping. This is the only chance I will have to reach you unsupervised." Sarah sat up straighter, started the car, and activated Bluetooth so she could talk while driving. "What do you need?" she asked. Connor's breathing was labored, the chest tube clearly still causing significant discomfort. "I need you to know they have been recording everything since I arrived at Mercy General. Audio, video, full surveillance, which means they have you on tape threatening Garrett. They are building a case, not against me, against you." The words hit like physical impact. Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "How do you know?" Connor's laugh was bitter. "Because I have been in enough debriefings to recognize when people are collecting evidence versus conducting actual medical assessment. The questions they ask, the way they position themselves. They are not worried about my recovery. They are worried about what I know and who I might tell." Sarah pulled out of the parking lot, took a route that allowed her to check for surveillance vehicles. Saw nothing obvious, but that meant little. Modern surveillance did not require visible tails, GPS trackers, cell phone monitoring, satellite imagery. The tools available to federal agencies made physical pursuit almost quaint. She focused on the immediate problem. What else did they say? Connor was quiet for a moment. Background noise suggested he was moving, probably walking to a location in his hospital room where conversation would be harder to monitor. They asked about my last deployment, about the investigation I was running, about why I was on that rooftop. I told them it was classified and I could not discuss without proper authorization. They said they had authorization, showed me paperwork that looked legitimate. I still refused because something felt wrong about the whole setup, Smart Sarah said. If they actually had proper authorization, they would not need to ask. They would already have access to mission reports and investigation files. The fact that they are fishing means they are trying to determine how much you know and whether you have shared it. Connor confirmed her analysis. That is what I thought. Which brings me to why I called. The investigation files. The evidence I was compiling about supply chain irregularities and operational compromises. I had backup copies on encrypted drives. They confiscated those when I was medevaced. Standard protocol for classified material. But there is another copy. Sarah's pulse quickened. Where? Connor's voice dropped even lower. Before my last deployment, I sent encrypted data to a secure server. Military network, but accessed through a civilian contractor portal that handles logistics coordination. I still have login credentials if they have not been fully deactivated. If we can access that server, we can retrieve the files. Everything I found. Names, transaction records, communication logs, evidence of systematic diversion of military resources. The implications were staggering. Real proof instead of pattern analysis and circumstantial observations. Documentation that could not be dismissed as conspiracy theory or misinterpretation. Sarah's mind raced through logistics. Accessing military servers without authorization was a federal crime. Getting caught would result in prosecution that would make Garrett's current threats look mild. but having the evidence could provide leverage they desperately needed, could transform their position from defensive to something approaching offensive capability. "What do you need from me?" Sarah asked. Connor outlined his thinking. His credentials might still be partially active if the medical evacuation was processed as active duty status rather than immediate discharge. Enough access to map the server structure and identify where his investigation data was stored. But he could not attempt the login from his current location. Too much monitoring, too much risk that any unusual activity would be flagged immediately. He needed someone on the outside, someone with technical skills and motivation to help, someone they could trust. Sarah thought about the resources available to her. Limited. She was a nurse, not a hacker. Her social network was intentionally minimal. But there was one person, a patient who had come through the ER 6 months ago with a minor injury. Woman named Angela Chen, former military intelligence who had transitioned to civilian cybersecurity consulting. Sarah had noticed her background because hospital security ran more thorough checks than standard for someone whose previous employment suggested clearance levels that civilian facilities rarely encountered. Chen had left contact information because she was interested in volunteer work with veteran support programs. Sarah had filed the card away, thinking it might be useful someday. That day had apparently arrived. She told Connor she might have a contact, would reach out and assess whether the person could be trusted with something this sensitive. Connor's relief was audible. "Thank you," he said, "for everything, for saving my life, for not walking away, for believing me when everyone else would call this paranoid conspiracy thinking." Sarah ended the call and drove home through morning traffic that was building toward rush hour density. Her apartment felt different when she entered. Not physically changed, but the space no longer represented sanctuary. Garrett knew where she lived, knew her routines, probably had surveillance established that would track her movements and contacts. She needed to assume everything she did was monitored, every conversation recorded, every digital communication logged and analyzed. She showered and changed into civilian clothes, made coffee she did not drink, sat at her small kitchen table, and retrieved the business card from the drawer where she kept things that seemed potentially useful. Angela Chen, cybersecurity consultant, specializing in data recovery and forensic analysis. Sarah composed an encrypted email using a service designed for secure communication. Kept the message vague enough to avoid triggering keyword monitoring. Requested consultation on a sensitive matter involving potential data breach and security irregularities. Sent it from a library computer during what would appear to be a routine errand. The response came within 90 minutes. Angela remembered Sarah, remembered the quiet nurse who had treated her injury with efficiency and the kind of situational awareness that spoke to training beyond medical school. She agreed to a meeting, neutral location, public enough to seem innocent, private enough for serious conversation. Coffee shop in a different part of the city. Nowhere near Sarah's apartment or the hospital or any location that would establish pattern. Sarah arrived early, chose a corner booth with sightlines to all entrances, watched customers come and go while appearing to read a book she had brought as cover. Angela arrived exactly on time, dressed professionally but not formally, moving with the controlled grace of someone who habitually checked surroundings and positioned herself strategically. She slid into the booth and ordered coffee from the passing barista before turning attention to Sarah. "You need data recovered from secure servers," Angela said. It was statement, not question. Sarah nodded fractionally. Angela continued. "This is not corporate espionage or personal information theft. This is military, classified, the kind of work that gets people disappeared if they are caught." Sarah met her eyes. Yes. Exactly that kind of work. Angela signaled for refill on coffee that had just arrived. Buying time to evaluate risk versus reward. "Why should I help you?" Sarah gave her truth. "Because soldiers are being killed by their own command structure to hide corruption. Because the people doing it have enough power to classify the evidence and enough reach to eliminate anyone who gets too close. Because someone needs to care about that, and I think you do, or you would not have agreed to this meeting. Angela sipped her coffee. Expression unreadable. How much proof do you have? Sarah slid a tablet across the table. On it was pattern analysis she had been building for 8 years. Dates, locations, names, injury reports, obituaries. Inconsistencies between official narratives and available evidence. Not definitive proof, but compelling enough to suggest systematic problems rather than isolated incidents. Angela scrolled through the data with eyes trained to spot patterns in information chaos. She stopped on the Kandahar entry, read the details, looked up at Sarah. You were there, Sarah confirmed. I was the medic who survived when 4 teammates did not. The official report attributes their deaths to enemy action and structural collapse. I documented blast patterns that tell different story. Patterns that match the injury I treated last night in my ER. Same signature, same precision, same impossible intelligence that allowed targeting of classified positions. Angela closed the tablet, slid it back. This is bigger than data recovery. This is whistleblowing against people with resources to make problems disappear permanently. I know, Sarah said, which is why I need help. Cannot do this alone. Angela studied her face for a long moment, seemed to come to some internal decision. I will help. But we do this smart. Get the data. Verify authenticity. Build airtight case before going public. Make sure when this breaks, it is too big to suppress and too distributed to contain. Agreed. They spent the next 2 hours planning. Angela explained technical requirements for accessing secure military servers. Needed inside assistance or vulnerability exploitation that would not trigger immediate security alerts. Sarah mentioned Connor's potentially active credentials. Angela saw possibility. If access was still live, even at reduced privilege level, it could provide mapping of server architecture. From there, became question of creating legitimate-looking request that would blend with normal traffic patterns. Sarah contacted Connor through burner phone purchased with cash at convenience store 3 miles from her apartment. Explained the plan. He had concerns about using credentials because any access would be logged and eventually traced back to him. Sarah pointed out he was already under suspicion. Difference was whether he was suspected of being victim or active participant in exposing the people responsible. Connor agreed, provided login information, walked through authentication process while Angela took notes. The access attempt was scheduled for 3 in the morning. Statistical analysis showed monitoring staff were least alert during that window. Human factors in security. Even the most sophisticated systems relied on people who got tired and made mistakes and failed to notice anomalies that should trigger investigation. Angela walked Connor through the process remotely, while Sarah watched for any indication the attempt had been detected. First, login failed, credentials partially locked. Second attempt using different access points succeeded. Read-only privileges to archived files from his task force investigation. Download began. Gigabytes of data transferring through encrypted channels while 3 people held collective breath and waited for alarms. 20 minutes felt like hours. Progress bars crept forward with agonizing slowness. Connor logged out when transfer completed. Wiped access logs as thoroughly as possible without administrator privileges. Angela verified data integrity. Files intact. Encrypted. Classification markings visible. Investigation notes. Communication logs. Financial transaction records showing irregularities in military supply chain accounting. Sarah read through files with growing horror. Scale was larger than imagined. Not isolated corruption, but networks spanning multiple branches and agencies. Connor's task force had been investigating what they thought was equipment theft. What they actually uncovered was institutionalized looting. Military supplies diverted to private contractors who sold to highest bidder, including hostile ASA actors. Billions of dollars, hundreds of transactions, dozens of officials involved at levels high enough to authorize shipments and classify inquiries. The operators who got too close were eliminated. Not all of them, just enough to slow investigation and create fear. Make others think twice before pushing too hard on questions that made powerful people uncomfortable. Kandahar, Connor's rooftop. 7 other cases documented in the files, all attributed to combat losses, all actually targeted removal of inconvenient investigators. Angela finished her analysis, looked at Sarah with expression equal parts respect and concern. This is career-ending for high-ranking officials. Prosecution-level evidence of treason and conspiracy to commit murder. If we release this, the blowback will be massive. People will go to prison. Agencies will be gutted. Investigations will span years. Sarah understood implications. Also understood alternative was allowing deaths to continue. We release it, she said. All of it. Simultaneously to media outlets, congressional oversight committees, inspector general offices, whistleblower protection organizations. Make it too widespread to contain and too documented to deny. Preparation took 2 days. Angela created redundant backup systems. Dead man switches that would trigger release if Sarah or Connor were harmed or disappeared. Sarah compiled medical documentation showing wound pattern consistency across cases. Connor provided testimony linking his investigation to attempted elimination. They coordinated with journalists who specialized in military accountability stories. Someone with credibility and track record that would ensure information was taken seriously rather than dismissed as conspiracy theory. Release was scheduled for simultaneous publication across multiple platforms. 3 days after Connor's injury. Long enough to verify everything. Quick enough that response could not be fully prepared. Sarah knew this timeline meant Garrett had those same 3 days to act. To arrest them. To seize equipment. To suppress the story before it broke. She also knew that moving against them would trigger automatic release, mutually assured destruction, the only leverage they had. On the night before scheduled publication, Sarah received unexpected visitor. She was in her apartment reviewing final documentation when knock came at her door. Firm, authoritative, not the tentative tap of neighbor or delivery person. She checked the peephole. Saw Garrett standing in the hallway, alone, no backup visible. She considered not answering. Knew avoidance was futile at this point. Opened the door, but did not invite him inside. "You are making catastrophic mistake," Garrett said without preamble. Sarah kept her hand on the door, ready to close it if necessary. "State your business or leave." Garrett pulled tablet from his jacket, showed her document. Federal warrant. Her name. Charges including mishandling classified information, conspiracy to commit espionage, theft of government property. Legally filed. Effective immediately. Similar warrants for Connor Hayes and Angela Chen. On what evidence, Sarah asked. Voice steady despite pulse elevation. Garrett's smile was cold. Testimony from military medical personnel stating you accessed and downloaded patient records without authorization. Communication logs showing contact with cybersecurity consultants who specialize in bypassing secure systems. Your own recorded admission that you have been compiling documentation of classified operations. Everything you did to protect yourself is being reframed as evidence of guilt. Sarah felt trap closing. Recognized the play, arrest her before publication, seize devices, lock her away while they suppressed the story. Classic counterintelligence operation. Neutralize the threat before it could cause damage. She asked the question that would determine her response. Does Connor have matching warrant? Garrett nodded. And Angela Chen. And the journalist you contacted. Everyone involved in your conspiracy to leak classified information. Sarah's mind raced through options. Running was not viable. Fighting arrest would confirm guilt. Only leverage was the dead man switch. If she was arrested and could not check in, automatic release triggered. But Garrett was smiling, which suggested he knew about the system and had countermeasure prepared. He confirmed her fear with his next statement. Your dead man switch requires multiple missed check-ins before activation. We know this because we have been monitoring your communications with Chen. We have time to intercept release before it goes public. Sarah stared at him, calculating whether he was bluffing about extent of their surveillance, whether they had actually compromised the systems Angela built, whether this was psychological operation designed to make her surrender without fight. Then she smiled, genuine expression that seemed to surprise Garrett more than any previous response. You are assuming our dead man switch is technology-based, she said, that it requires digital check-ins and automated triggers. You assume wrong. Garrett's confidence flickered. What did you do? Sarah explained. Angela Chen had connections throughout cybersecurity and intelligence communities. People who owed favors. People who believed in accountability. Data had already been distributed to multiple trusted individuals with instructions to release if any investigation team members were arrested, harmed, or disappeared. Those individuals were not connected electronically. They received physical copies delivered by courier, old-school intelligence tradecraft, the kind that predated digital surveillance. You cannot intercept what you cannot trace, Sarah said. Cannot suppress what you cannot locate. Cannot stop people who are not part of any network you are monitoring. Garrett's face went pale as he understood. She had outmaneuvered him using techniques from era before electronic communication dominated intelligence operations. Human networks, physical documents, personal trust instead of technological security. The oldest and most reliable form of information protection. So here is what happens next. Sarah continued. You withdraw that warrant. You close your investigation into our activities. You allow publication to proceed without interference. In exchange, we ensure documentation focuses on corruption and murder rather than naming every single person involved at every level. We give you opportunity to clean house internally before full extent becomes public. Chance to save institutional reputation by demonstrating accountability instead of cover-up. This is blackmail, Garrett said, voice tight with controlled anger. Sarah shook her head. This is negotiation. You have power. We have truth. Both sides lose if this becomes total war. We are offering path where accountability happens, but institutions survive. Take it or face complete exposure. Not just the corruption Connor was investigating. Everything. Every operator burned. Every family lied to. Every report falsified. All of it documented and distributed and ready for release if you push us. Garrett made phone call, spoke in careful language that suggested consultation with superiors. Conversation lasted 15 minutes. When he disconnected, his expression was defeat dressed as professional acceptance. You have your terms. Warrants will be withdrawn. Investigations will proceed through proper channels. Your immunity will be documented. Publication proceeds as scheduled. Sarah nodded. Garrett turned to leave, but paused at threshold. You understand this makes you permanent enemies. People who will wait years for opportunity to retaliate. Sarah met his eyes. I have been living with enemies since Kandahar. At least now they will be officially acknowledged instead of hiding behind classification. Difference is I am not alone anymore. I have witnesses. I have documentation. I have people who know the truth and will not stay silent if something happens to me. That is more protection than I had 8 years ago. Garrett left. Sarah closed the door, locked it, stood in her apartment feeling weight of what had just happened settle over her like physical presence. She had gambled everything on bluff backed by enough truth to make it credible. Had bet that Garrett valued institutional preservation more than personal revenge. Had wagered her freedom and possibly her life on assumption that exposure was worse for them than negotiated accountability. She would know in approximately 12 hours whether the bet paid off or whether she had just accelerated her own destruction. Either way, there was no going back. The quiet life was over. Sarah Mitchell, the invisible night shift nurse, had ceased to exist the moment she whispered Connor's call sign. What remained was someone who would have to navigate the aftermath of choosing truth over safety, justice over anonymity, the lives of future operators over her own peaceful obscurity. She sat on her couch, opened laptop, drafted email to Dr. Mitchell requesting leave of absence, did not send it yet. Wanted to see how publication played out before making decisions about her nursing career. Wanted to know if she would still have career, or if the next few days would reshape her life so completely that returning to hospital shifts became impossible. Her phone buzzed. Message from Angela. Journalist confirmed ready for morning publication. All outlets coordinated. Dead man switches verified active. Physical copies distributed to 7 individuals in 4 countries. No single point of failure. No way to suppress simultaneously. Sarah typed response. Thank you for believing me, for taking the risk, for being the kind of person who thinks accountability matters more than convenience. Then Angela's reply was simple. Some fights are worth the cost. This is one of them. Sarah closed her eyes, thought about the teammates she could not save in Kandahar, about Connor bleeding on a gurney, about 7 other operators whose deaths were attributed to enemy action when the real enemy wore friendly uniforms, about families who deserved truth even when truth was harder than comfortable lies. Tomorrow, the story would break. Tomorrow, the carefully constructed narrative about operational losses and combat casualties would crack open. Tomorrow, people would start asking questions that had been suppressed for years. Tomorrow, accountability would begin even if justice remained elusive. Tonight, Sarah Mitchell sat alone in an apartment that no longer felt like hiding place and waited for morning. Waited for consequences. Waited to see if choosing to speak after 8 years of silence would save lives, or simply end her own in different way than Kandahar had threatened. The weight of silence had been crushing. The weight of speaking might prove fatal. But at least now, the weight was shared. At least now, she was not carrying it alone. At least now, when she closed her eyes, she could tell the ghosts of her teammates that she had finally done what she should have done 8 years ago. She had refused to be complicit, had refused to let their deaths be meaningless, had transformed her survival into something approaching purpose. Whether that purpose would be enough remained to be seen. Whether she had made the right choice would be determined by events beyond her control. But for the first time, since Kandahar, Sarah felt something other than the hollow exhaustion of someone merely existing. She felt the dangerous, sharp-edged sensation of being truly alive, engaged in fight that mattered, contributing to something larger than her own safety or comfort. The night passed slowly. Sarah did not sleep, did not even try. Just sat and watched the hours count down toward morning, toward publication, toward whatever came next in a life that had stopped being predictable, the moment she chose to answer a dying man's call for help with truth instead of protocol. Publication happened at 6 in the morning on a Thursday. Sarah knew the exact moment because she was watching 12 different news websites refresh simultaneously on her laptop screen. The headlines appeared within seconds of each other. Coordinated release across major networks, independent journalism organizations, military-focused media outlets. The wording varied, but the message was identical. Classified investigation reveals systematic corruption led to operator deaths. The response was immediate and massive. Sarah watched social media explode, with reactions ranging from outrage to disbelief to demands for congressional hearings. Veteran organizations issued statements calling for accountability. Military families who had been told their loved ones died in combat operations now had evidence suggesting something darker and more deliberate. Within 90 minutes, 3 separate congressional representatives announced intentions to launch investigations. Within 2 hours, the Pentagon press office released carefully worded statement acknowledging awareness of allegations and commitment to thorough review. Sarah's phone rang. Connor's voice came through stronger than their last conversation. Less medication, more clarity. They are moving fast to discharge me, he said, separating me from active duty before the full scope of my involvement becomes public knowledge. Medical retirement with honors. Full benefits. Happening today instead of the standard weeks-long process. They want me out of their facility and beyond their responsibility. Are you safe? Sarah asked. Connor's laugh carried bitter edge. Safer than I was 3 days ago. Too visible now to disappear quietly. Too many people know my name and story, but they are making it clear I should accept the discharge and move on with my life. No interviews, no testimony beyond what is already in the documents, no further involvement in investigations that will follow. Sarah understood the implied threat. Cooperate with silence or face consequences that would make the rooftop injury look accidental. What are you going to do? She asked. Connor was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised her. I am going to fight. Not the way they expect. Not with public statements or media appearances. But I cannot go back to active duty with medical discharge. Cannot pretend the last week did not happen. Cannot ignore that there are more operators out there being used as expendable assets in operations designed to protect corruption. I need to do something. Build something. Use what I know to help others who suspect their injuries or circumstances were not what official reports claim. Sarah felt something shift in her chest. Recognition of shared purpose. She had spent 8 years hiding from exactly the kind of fight Connor was describing. Spent 8 years telling herself that staying quiet was the only way to survive. But the last 72 hours had proven that some things mattered more than survival. Some truths demanded to be spoken regardless of personal cost. What do you need? She asked. Time, Connor said. Space to figure out what this looks like. Maybe a partner who understands both the medical and operational aspects. Someone who can recognize patterns that others miss. Someone who already proved she is willing to risk everything for accountability. He was asking without asking, giving her option to decline without having to explicitly refuse. Sarah looked around her apartment, saw the life she had built on foundation of invisibility and routine, saw the alternative that Connor was offering, the chance to transform her survival into something that might prevent other families from receiving the same lies hers had been told about Kandahar. Let me think about it, she said. Connor accepted the boundary. No pressure, no timeline. Just offer standing whenever she was ready. They ended the call, and Sarah sat with the weight of decision she had not expected to face. Return to hospital nursing and hope the attention faded. Or commit fully to the fight she had started when she answered a call sign that was supposed to be dead. Her phone rang again. Hospital administration. Dr. Mitchell requesting her presence for emergency meeting. Sarah, dressed in clean scrubs more from habit than necessity, drove to Mercy General expecting termination. Found instead something she had not anticipated. Recognition. Dr. Mitchell sat across from her in his office with the chief of staff present. Both wore expressions that were complicated. Professional concern mixed with something approaching respect. We have been reviewing the events of your last shift, Dr. Mitchell began. The intervention with the trauma patient, the procedures you performed, the aftermath with federal agents. Sarah waited for the dismissal, for the explanation that her actions violated protocols and created liability the hospital could not accept. Instead, the chief of staff spoke. We also reviewed the publication this morning. Read the documentation about military corruption and operator casualties. Saw your name listed among the investigators who compiled the evidence. Dr. Mitchell continued where the chief left off. What you did falls under whistleblower protections. Federal law. We cannot terminate you for exposing illegal activity, even if your methods were irregular. We cannot ignore that you risked your career and potentially your freedom to reveal systematic harm. Sarah absorbed this carefully. They were not condoning her actions. but they were acknowledging that her motivations aligned with medical ethics and professional responsibility to prevent harm. The meeting ended with her employment intact and suggestion that she might consider speaking with other staff about recognizing signs of injuries that did not match official stories, not for publicity, for education. So future providers understood what to look for when something felt wrong about a patient presentation. She left the office and found Nurse Jenkins waiting in the hallway, clearly having timed her presence to intercept Sarah after the meeting. They walked together toward the break room in silence until Jenkins spoke. The entire staff has been talking about what you did, about who you were before you came here, about whether we should have seen the signs. Sarah shrugged. You saw what I wanted you to see, what I needed to be to survive. Jenkins stopped walking, turned to face her directly. Is that still what you need? The question carried weight beyond casual inquiry. Sarah realized this was offer. Permission to stop hiding, to be present instead of invisible, to allow her past and present to coexist instead of treating them as incompatible identities that could never occupy the same space. I do not know yet, Sarah said honestly. Ask me again in a week. Jenkins nodded, seemed to understand that transformation could not be rushed, that Sarah needed time to decide who she wanted to become, now that the choice was hers, instead of being dictated by fear and necessity. They continued to the break room where other staff members looked up with expressions that had changed from indifference to curiosity to something approaching respect. 2 weeks after publication, Connor was discharged in a private ceremony at the military hospital. Sarah attended at his request, watched as he received medals earned years ago but delayed by bureaucratic processes that suddenly accelerated. His family was there. Parents who had nearly lost their son and now understood the truth was more complicated and darker than training accident. They thanked Sarah with tears and embraces that made her profoundly uncomfortable because she did not feel deserving of gratitude for simply refusing to be complicit in lies. After the ceremony, Connor asked if she would walk with him through the hospital grounds. They moved in silence until he spoke. I have been thinking about what happens next. Cannot go back to active duty. Medical discharge is permanent. But also cannot walk away from this. Too many questions still unanswered. Too many people who participated in the corruption and will escape consequences because they had rank and classification protecting them. He outlined his idea. Consulting firm working with veterans who suspected their injuries or discharge circumstances were not what official reports claimed. Help them document cases, connect with legal resources, use the platform to push for continued accountability. He wanted Sarah to consider joining, not full-time, not abandoning nursing, but as someone who understood both medical and operational aspects. Someone who could read the patterns others missed. Sarah told him she needed time to think. Truth was, she needed to decide who she wanted to be. The nurse who treated patients without asking uncomfortable questions. Or the person who asked questions even when answers were dangerous. Both had value. Both required different kinds of courage. She was not sure which version of herself she could sustain long-term. Angela Chen reached out 3 days later with information that federal investigations spawned by their publication had led to indictments. 7 high-ranking officers charged with conspiracy and corruption. Dozens more facing disciplinary action and discharge. The supply chain irregularities Connor's task force identified were being prosecuted with evidence from the files they released. Not complete justice. Some people involved would escape through immunity deals and classification protections. But more accountability than seemed possible a month ago. Angela suggested meeting for coffee to discuss future collaboration opportunities. Sarah agreed because Angela represented network that made continued investigation possible. They met at the same coffee shop where they had planned the data recovery operation. Angela looked different, less cautious, more open. Success of their operation had given her credibility in circles that previously dismissed her as too idealistic about military accountability. She had been approached by other whistleblowers, people with evidence of wrongdoing who needed help navigating complex process of exposure without self-destruction. She wanted to build something sustainable, organization providing resources and protection for people trying to bring truth into light. Sarah listened and saw herself reflected in Angela's determination. The need to transform trauma into purpose, to make suffering mean something beyond personal damage. But Sarah also saw the cost. The target that Angela was painting on herself by making this her public mission. The attention from people who valued secrecy over accountability and had resources to make problems disappear. She asked the question that mattered. Are you prepared for what comes next? The retaliation, the surveillance, the attempts to discredit or intimidate, or worse. Angela's smile was thin. I have been preparing my entire career. This is not impulsive decision. This is culmination of 15 years watching good people destroyed for asking questions that threatened powerful interests. I am done watching, ready to fight. Question is whether you are ready to join me or if you need more time. Sarah did not answer immediately. She was thinking about Connor bleeding on a gurney, about teammates who died in Kandahar, about families who deserved truth, about operators currently serving who might face similar betrayals if nothing changed. She was thinking about the choice between safety and purpose, between invisibility and impact, between the life she had built and the life she might still create. I need to finish some things first, Sarah said, but ask me again in 6 months. Angela accepted the timeline, understood that commitment to this kind of work could not be rushed or coerced, had to come from a place of genuine conviction or it would not sustain through inevitable difficulties ahead. Sarah's apartment gradually changed over the following weeks. She stopped treating it as temporary hiding place and started making it feel like actual home. Added photos from military service, unit insignia, dog tags she had kept buried in drawer, not trying to reclaim that identity entirely, just acknowledging it had existed and shaped who she became. The duality of being both Petty Officer Mitchell and Nurse Sarah could coexist if she stopped forcing them into separate compartments. 6 months after publication, Sarah stood at podium in hotel conference room addressing audience of emergency physicians and trauma nurses. The topic was recognizing patterns of intentional injury disguised as accident or combat trauma. She spoke about wound analysis, fragmentation distribution, blast signatures, the importance of thorough documentation when something felt inconsistent with official story. She did not explicitly discuss her own experiences, but the audience understood her knowledge came from more than textbook study. During question period, someone asked if she thought medical professionals had responsibility to question official narratives when evidence did not align. Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. We have responsibility to document truth, she said. What happens with that documentation is not always within our control, but the act of witnessing accurately, of recording what we see rather than what we are told we should see. That is fundamental to medical ethics. We owe it to our patients to see them clearly, even when clarity is uncomfortable, especially then. The response was sustained applause that felt both validating and overwhelming. After presentation, several attendees approached with stories of their own cases where something felt wrong, but they had not pushed because questioning authority seemed too risky. Sarah listened and provided what guidance she could. Connect with advocacy organizations. Document thoroughly. Trust instincts. Do not assume silence is safer than speaking. Connor's consulting firm grew slowly but steadily over those same 6 months. He handled intake and case coordination while Sarah provided medical analysis on contract basis. They took cases larger organizations overlooked, veterans with injuries not matching discharge paperwork, families asking questions about deaths that official investigations closed too quickly. The work was difficult and sometimes heartbreaking because not every case had answers and not every wrong could be righted. But the act of witnessing, of confirming suspicions were valid and concerns legitimate. That provided value even when justice remained elusive. 1 year after publication, Sarah received letter from family of one of the operators killed in Kandahar. They found her through news coverage of the investigation, wanted to thank her for finally giving them truth about how their son died. Not enemy action and heroic sacrifice as they were told, but targeted elimination because he was investigating corruption. The letter included photo of young man in uniform, smiling at camera with confidence of someone who believed his service mattered. Sarah kept the photo on her desk at hospital. Reminder of why she broke silence, why some truths were worth cost of speaking. The young man's name was David Patterson, 24 years old, specialist in communications intelligence. He had identified irregularities in supply manifests 3 weeks before Kandahar mission, had sent preliminary report up chain of command, requesting authorization to investigate further. 2 weeks later, he was assigned to Sarah's unit for mission that was supposed to be routine intelligence gathering. 1 week after that, he was dead in stairwell collapse that Sarah now understood was not collapse at all. She wrote back to his family, told them David had been brave and competent and someone she wished she had known better before he died. Told them she was sorry she had not spoken sooner. Sorry she had let 8 years pass while they believed a lie. Sorry that her silence had been prioritized over their right to know truth about their son's death. The response came quickly. They did not blame her. Understood she had been trapped by classification and fear and trauma. Were grateful she had finally found courage to speak, even knowing the cost. That gratitude sat heavy in Sarah's chest. She did not feel she deserved it. Did not feel her actions rose to level of heroism or even basic decency. She had done what should have been done 8 years ago, had simply stopped being complicit in a system that valued institutional protection over individual lives. That was baseline morality, not exceptional courage. But the family's forgiveness mattered anyway. Gave her permission to forgive herself for the years of silence, for the choices made in Kandahar, for surviving when better people had not. Hospital gradually shifted its perception of her. Quiet Mitchell became Mitchell, who testified before Congressional Subcommittee about patterns of operational casualties. Mitchell, who appeared in documentary interviews about military accountability. Mitchell, who wrote medical journal article on forensic analysis of combat injuries and the responsibility of civilian providers to document inconsistencies. The transformation was uncomfortable. She had preferred invisibility, but she was learning that visibility had power too. That being known meant she could advocate for patients who might otherwise be dismissed. That her credibility extended beyond immediate cases to broader questions of institutional integrity. Garrett disappeared from public view. Sarah heard through intelligence community contacts that he took early retirement and relocated overseas. Whether this represented genuine exile or strategic repositioning, she could not determine. Did not spend energy trying to track him. He was no longer primary concern. There were other operators still at risk. Other investigations being quietly suppressed. Other families being lied to. The work of accountability did not end with one publication or one set of indictments. Continued in daily choices to document accurately, speak carefully, refuse complicity in systems that valued secrecy over truth. 2 years after publication, Connor offered Sarah full partnership in consulting firm, walking away from hospital nursing entirely to focus on investigation and advocacy. It would mean giving up stability and routine she had built over decade. Would mean accepting she could not fully separate past from present. Would mean choosing to be visible and active rather than quiet and observant. She thought about Sniper, who trusted her with his life because she answered his call sign. About families who finally had truth about their losses. about young nurses at medical conference who approached her saying she inspired them to trust instincts about suspicious cases, about the work that still needed doing and the lives that might be saved if someone was willing to fight for accountability. The choice was not between two different careers, was between two different versions of herself. The one who survived by hiding, and the one who might thrive by engaging. Both had value. Both required courage in different forms. Sarah made her decision not based on what was safer or easier, but on what felt necessary. She accepted partnership, reduced hospital shifts to part-time, began building something new from foundation of everything she had walked away from years ago. On her last full-time shift at Mercy General, the night staff threw impromptu gathering in break room. Nurse Jenkins presented her with plaque reading, simply, Sarah Mitchell, RN, who reminds us that bearing witness is an act of service. Sarah held the plaque and felt emotion threatening to overflow in ways she had not allowed herself to feel in years. These people had watched her transform from invisible to unavoidable, and they were celebrating rather than resenting the disruption. Dr. Mitchell shook her hand, told her she would be missed, but her new work mattered too much to let sentiment interfere with necessity. He had supported her through crisis that could have ended her career, had chosen to believe her competence mattered more than her irregularity, had given her space to be both nurse and something else simultaneously. She thanked him, knowing words were inadequate for expressing what his trust had meant. Walking out of Mercy General for last time as full-time employee, Sarah paused in parking lot where she once confronted Garrett. The space felt different now, less threatening, more like place where she made choice that changed trajectory. Her phone buzzed with message from Connor. First case consultation scheduled for tomorrow morning. Are you ready? Sarah typed response with hands that were steady and certain. Born ready. She got in her car and drove toward whatever came next, knowing she was finally, after years of hiding, moving in right direction. Not away from her past, but through it. Carrying weight, but no longer crushed beneath it. Finding purpose in patterns written in blood and silence that she once tried desperately to ignore. The work would continue. Questions would remain. Cost of service and price of accountability would continue extracting payment from those willing to bear witness. But Sarah was no longer alone in that burden. She had Connor, Angela, families who reached out for help, young professionals inspired to ask harder questions, network of people who believed truth mattered more than convenience. Together, they were building something that looked less like victory and more like persistence. Stubborn refusal to accept that silence was safety. Daily choice to document and witness and speak even when speaking carried risk. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new families seeking answers, new operators questioning official narratives about their service and sacrifice. Tomorrow, Sarah would begin the work she had been preparing for, without knowing it, since the day she walked away from Kandahar, carrying guilt and trauma, and the conviction that she never wanted to make life or death decisions again. Turned out, life had different plans. Turned out the best way to honor the dead was to fight for the living. Turned out that speaking truth after years of silence was not the end of her story, but the beginning of something she had not known she needed. Purpose forged from pain. Meaning extracted from loss. The transformation of survival into service. She drove through Virginia Beach streets, thinking about 6 syllables whispered in emergency room. Shadow 1, actual. The call sign that ended her invisibility and began her transformation. She did not regret speaking those words. Regretted only that it took someone nearly dying to give her permission to stop hiding. But perhaps the lesson was not that she should have spoken sooner, but that when the moment demanded it, she found courage to answer the call, even knowing the cost. Especially knowing the cost. Because that was what operators did. They showed up when called. They honored bonds forged in fire. They carried brothers forward, even when path led through darkness toward uncertain light. Part 6. The Weight We Carry. 3 years after publication, Sarah Mitchell stood in a small office in Arlington, reviewing files for a case that would probably break her heart. The pattern was familiar by now. Marine corporal injured during training exercise at 29 Palms. Official report attributed compound fracture and internal bleeding to fall from obstacle course. Family suspected something else because their daughter had been asking questions about equipment procurement irregularities in the weeks before her injury. Questions that made her superiors uncomfortable. Questions that stopped when she stopped being able to ask them. Connor sat across the desk, reading medical records with the careful attention of someone who understood that details mattered. That the difference between accident and attack often lived in millimeters and angles that civilian investigators missed or ignored. He had gotten better at this work over 3 years. Learned to read not just what was documented, but what was conspicuously absent. The gaps where information should exist, but had been redacted or simply never recorded. This looks like the Patterson case, he said, referring to incident from 18 months ago. Different mechanism, but same signature. Injury severe enough to require medical separation, but not fatal. Convenient removal of someone asking inconvenient questions. Sarah nodded. She saw it too. The precision that suggested planning rather than accident. The timing that was too perfect to be coincidental. The official investigation that concluded with suspicious speed and minimal scrutiny. They had handled 47 cases in 3 years. Not all of them showed evidence of deliberate harm. Some were genuine accidents. Some were combat casualties that families struggled to accept because grief demanded someone to blame beyond the chaos of war. But enough cases showed patterns. Enough investigations revealed inconsistencies. Enough families received truth that had been hidden behind classification and bureaucratic indifference. The work mattered even when justice remained elusive, even when the people responsible escaped consequences. The act of witnessing and documenting and refusing to accept official narratives without evidence created accountability that had not existed before. Sarah's phone rang, hospital calling. She was still working part-time shifts in Mercy General ER, had discovered she needed both aspects of her life, the immediate tangible work of treating patients, and the longer, deeper work of investigating systemic failures. One grounded her, the other gave her purpose beyond routine. Together, they formed something approaching balance, even if that balance was fragile and required constant recalibration. The call was about a patient presenting with injuries inconsistent with his stated cause. Motorcycle accident, supposedly. But wound pattern suggested close-range impact rather than road crash. Police were involved, but patient was refusing to speak with them. Requesting Sarah specifically. She told them she would be there in 20 minutes. Connor looked up from the files. Go. I will continue reviewing this. We can discuss when you get back. Sarah grabbed her keys and headed for the door, paused at threshold and turned back. Connor was already deep in documents, highlighting sections, making notes in margins. The same meticulous attention he had once applied to combat intelligence now focused on uncovering truth that powerful interests wanted buried. He looked different than he had 3 years ago. Older, more worn, but also more certain. More grounded in purpose that went beyond following orders or executing missions. He had found meaning in the aftermath of betrayal, and that meaning sustained him through work that would have broken someone less committed. The drive to Mercy General took her through streets she knew by heart now. Arlington had become home in ways Virginia Beach never had. Not because the city was special, but because she had stopped running. Had planted roots instead of maintaining perpetual readiness to disappear. Her apartment had books now, photos, kitchen equipment that suggested she actually cooked instead of surviving on protein bars and coffee. Small changes that marked transition from existence to life. At the hospital, she found her patient in Bay 4. Young man, early 20s, Hispanic. Tattoos suggesting military affiliation, though he was dressed in civilian clothes. The injuries were exactly as described. Impact trauma to torso, fractured ribs, internal bruising, pattern that did not match motorcycle crash, pattern that looked disturbingly like close-range assault with blunt object. Deliberate, controlled. The kind of beating that stopped just short of fatal because the goal was message, not murder. Sarah introduced herself. The young man's eyes tracked her movements with wariness that spoke to training and trauma. "You are the nurse they talk about," he said. Voice rough with pain and something else. Hope, maybe. Or desperation. The one who used to be military. Who helps people when official stories do not make sense? Sarah pulled a stool close to the bed. Sat so they were at eye level. "I am a nurse," she confirmed. "What I used to be is complicated. But yes, I help when I can. Tell me what really happened." The story came out slowly, haltingly. The young man's name was Marcus Rivera, Army specialist, served 2 deployments, recently returned stateside and working as contractor for logistics company. He had noticed discrepancies in inventory manifests, equipment disappearing, paperwork showing deliveries that never arrived. He mentioned it to his supervisor, who told him to focus on his assigned duties. He mentioned it to another contractor who worked the same warehouse. That contractor disappeared. Just stopped showing up. No explanation. No forwarding information. Marcus started documenting what he saw, taking photos of manifests, recording serial numbers from equipment that should not have been there, building case he planned to take to Inspector General. 3 days ago, 2 men approached him in parking lot after his shift. No identification, no explanation, just methodical beating that left him conscious enough to understand the message. Stop asking questions. Stop documenting. Forget what he saw, or next time they would not stop short of permanent solution. Sarah listened without interrupting. When Marcus finished, she asked the questions that mattered. "Did you report this to police?" He shook his head. "They told me if I involved authorities, they would make sure I was charged with theft of the same equipment I was trying to report missing. Would plant evidence, falsify records, make me the criminal instead of the witness." Sarah understood. Classic intimidation tactic. Turn victim into perpetrator to discourage cooperation with legitimate investigation. "Do you still have the documentation you compiled?" Sarah asked. Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "Cloud storage, encrypted, multiple backups. I am not stupid. I knew this was dangerous." Sarah felt something settle in her chest. This was not just another case. This was active operation. Current corruption. People willing to use violence to protect it. This was exactly what she and Connor had been preparing for. The chance to intervene before another operator ended up dead or disappeared. She took Marcus's contact information, told him she would reach out within 24 hours, advised him to stay somewhere other than his home, with family or friends, somewhere the men who beat him would not easily find him. Marcus agreed, asked what she could actually do. Sarah gave him honest answer. "I do not know yet, but I know people who are very good at turning evidence into accountability. People who have resources to protect witnesses and pressure authorities to actually investigate instead of accepting cover stories." After Marcus was stabilized and admitted for observation, Sarah called Angela, explained the situation. Angela listened and then was quiet for a long moment. "This is different from our usual work," she finally said. "Usually we are investigating historical cases, things that happened months or years ago. This is active, ongoing, people willing to use violence right now to protect their operation. We need to be careful, need to assume they are monitoring Marcus and anyone he contacts." Sarah agreed, but also pointed out that being careful should not mean being passive. Marcus had evidence, had testimony, had injuries that corroborated his account of assault. They had opportunity to stop this before he became another casualty report filed away and forgotten. Angela made decision quickly. Bring him in. We will secure the documentation, verify what he found, build case, and take it to authorities who cannot ignore physical evidence and witness testimony. But we move fast, before they have time to disappear him or discredit his evidence. The next 72 hours were intense coordination. Angela brought in forensic accountants to analyze the inventory records Marcus provided. Connor contacted Inspector General's office through back channels he had cultivated over 3 years. Sarah worked with prosecutors from Military Justice Division to build criminal case against the people responsible. Not just the contractors who beat Marcus, but the officials who created environment where such corruption could flourish. The breakthrough came when forensic analysis revealed connection between the logistics company Marcus worked for and the same supply chain network that Connor had been investigating 3 years ago. Same parent corporation. Same financial structures designed to obscure ownership and transactions. Different personnel, but identical methodology. The corruption Connor uncovered had not been eliminated by the indictments and reforms. It had adapted, moved to different facilities, changed names and operational details, but continued the same fundamental theft. This discovery transformed the case from isolated incident to evidence of systemic failure. Proof that the accountability measures implemented after publication of Connor's investigation had been insufficient. That powerful interests had simply waited for attention to fade before resuming operations with slightly more sophisticated concealment. The realization was both devastating and galvanizing. Devastating because it meant their work 3 years ago had not solved the problem. Galvanizing because it provided motivation to push harder and deeper than before. The case broke publicly 6 weeks after Marcus presented at Mercy General ER. Federal raids on multiple logistics facilities across 3 states. Arrests of contractors and military officials. Seizure of financial records documenting hundreds of millions in diverted equipment and fraudulent transactions. Media coverage that connected the current investigation to the earlier revelations about operational casualties. Congressional hearings where Marcus testified about intimidation and assault. Where Sarah provided medical analysis of injury patterns consistent with deliberate attack rather than accident. The trial took 9 months. Sarah attended key sessions when her testimony was required. Sat in courtroom and watched defense attorneys try to discredit Marcus as disgruntled employee, motivated by financial gain rather than genuine concern. Watched prosecutors systematically dismantle those arguments with documentation and forensic evidence. Watched jury deliberate for 4 days before returning guilty verdicts against 7 defendants, including 2 senior officials who had escaped prosecution in the earlier investigation. When the verdicts were read, Sarah felt something release in her chest. Not triumph, exactly. The victory was too small and too late for the operators who had already died or been destroyed. But vindication. Proof that persistence mattered. That refusing to accept official narratives and continuing to ask difficult questions could produce meaningful accountability, even when the system was designed to prevent it. Marcus approached her after the trial concluded. Thanked her for believing him when he had every reason to expect no one would. Told her he was planning to go back to school, get degree in criminal justice, maybe work as investigator, focusing on military corruption cases. Sarah recognized the impulse, the need to transform trauma into purpose, to make suffering mean something beyond personal damage. She told him to call if he needed guidance or support. Gave him contact information for Angela's organization and Connor's firm. Told him he was part of Network now. Community of people committed to accountability, even when commitment carried costs. Years continued to accumulate. Cases continued to arrive. Some they could help. Some they could not. The work did not get easier, but Sarah got better at carrying the weight. better at accepting that she could not save everyone, or fix every injustice or prevent every tragedy. Better at recognizing that bearing witness was itself valuable, even when it did not produce the outcomes she wanted. Her apartment filled slowly with artifacts of life fully lived. Books from authors she discovered she enjoyed. Plants that required care and attention. Kitchen tools she actually used for cooking meals instead of just reheating prepared food. Photos from cases they solved. Letters from families expressing gratitude. Newspaper clippings documenting accountability achieved through work she contributed to. The space stopped being hiding place and became home. Mercy General promoted her to senior ER nurse and asked her to develop training program on recognizing non-accidental trauma, teaching other providers what signs to look for when injuries did not match reported circumstances. How to document thoroughly. When to involve authorities. How to support patients who might be victims of assault or intimidation. The work allowed her to extend her impact beyond individual cases. To create systemic change in how civilian medical facilities approached potential evidence of crime or abuse. Connor's firm expanded to include 3 additional investigators and 2 attorneys specializing in military justice. They moved into larger office space, hired administrative staff, developed protocols and procedures that would allow the work to continue even if something happened to the founders. The transformation from scrappy operation running on determination and improvisation into sustainable organization felt both necessary and slightly uncomfortable. Growth brought resources, but also bureaucracy. Efficiency, but also distance from the immediate personal connection that had defined their early cases. Sarah found herself navigating role she had not anticipated. Mentor to younger investigators who wanted to follow similar path. Teacher to medical providers learning to recognize patterns she had spent years documenting. Advocate for policy changes that would make it harder for corruption to flourish unchecked. The work expanded beyond individual cases into broader questions of institutional reform and cultural transformation. She was no longer just bearing witness. She was building systems that would continue bearing witness after she was gone. 5 years after publication, Sarah received invitation to speak at Naval Special Warfare Command graduation ceremony. The invitation came from new commanding officer who had read about her work and believed incoming operators needed to hear from someone who understood both the honor of service and the reality of institutional betrayal. Sarah initially declined, did not feel qualified to address people preparing to deploy into danger she had spent years trying to escape. But Connor encouraged her to accept, told her the next generation deserved to hear truth from someone who had lived it, rather than sanitized version from officers who had never faced similar choices. She accepted, prepared remarks that balanced respect for service with acknowledgement of complexities. Stood before 200 newly graduated operators and told them the truth, that they would face situations where following orders conflicted with doing what was right. That the chain of command was composed of humans who sometimes made decisions motivated by self-interest rather than mission success. That speaking truth to power carried costs, but silence carried greater costs. That their most important loyalty was to each other and to the principles they swore to defend, not to individuals or institutions that might betray those principles. The response was mixed. Some operators appreciated her honesty. Some found it inappropriate or demoralizing. The commanding officer thanked her and told her privately that several senior leaders had objected to her speaking, but he believed the message was necessary, even if uncomfortable. Sarah left the base feeling uncertain whether she had helped or hurt, whether honest warning better prepared operators for reality or just made them cynical before they had earned the right to cynicism through experience. A week later, she received email from one of the new graduates. Young woman, 23 years old, preparing for first deployment. The message was brief but powerful. Thank you for telling us the truth. My uncle died in Kandahar. Official report said enemy action. I always wondered if there was more to the story. Your speech made me realize that asking questions is not disrespect. It is honoring the sacrifice by refusing to let it be meaningless. I will remember that when I deploy. When I face situations where something does not feel right, I will have courage to speak because you showed me that silence serves the people who should be held accountable. Sarah read the email 3 times, felt weight settle across her shoulders that was simultaneously burden and privilege. This was the real work. Not just investigating past failures, but preventing future ones by changing culture that had allowed corruption and betrayal to flourish. By teaching new generation of operators that accountability was not weakness, but necessary foundation for trust that kept teams alive. She printed the email and added it to the wall in her office, where she kept reminders of why the work mattered. Photos of operators whose cases they had solved. Letters from families who finally had truth. Newspaper clippings documenting convictions and reforms. Each item represented small victory in larger war that would never be fully won but had to be continuously fought. Connor found her staring at the wall one afternoon, asked what she was thinking. Sarah considered the question carefully. "I am thinking about Patterson," she said. "About the 4 teammates I lost in Kandahar. About whether the work we are doing would have saved them if someone had been doing it back then." Connor sat down heavily. "We cannot know that," he said. "Cannot change the past. Can only try to prevent the same failures from killing people in the future." Sarah knew he was right. Knew that dwelling on what-ifs was unproductive. But she also knew that the dead deserved to be remembered. That their names and faces and the circumstances of their deaths mattered beyond abstract lessons about systemic reform. They were people. Brothers and sisters who trusted the system to protect them and were betrayed. Keeping their memory alive was part of the work. Refusing to let them become statistics or case numbers or forgotten casualties of classified operations that officially never happened. 10 years after publication, Array stood at cemetery in Arlington, Patterson's grave. She visited every year on anniversary of Kandahar, brought flowers, spent few minutes in silence, told him what she had accomplished in the past year, what cases they had solved, what reforms they had achieved, what operators they had helped. It was ritual that served no practical purpose but felt necessary anyway. Connection to the person she had been and the promise she made to herself in the stairwell when she could not save him. That she would make his death mean something. That she would fight to prevent others from dying the same way. She was not alone at the grave this year. Patterson's parents were there. They came sometimes, had grown comfortable with Sarah's presence over the years, had learned to see her not as the medic who failed to save their son, but as the person who finally told them truth about his death and continued fighting for accountability in his memory. They stood together in silence. Shared grief that time had softened but not eliminated. Shared determination that David Patterson's life and death would matter beyond the pain of loss. His mother spoke quietly. "We received letter last week from the Inspector General's office. Investigation David started before he died. The one that got him killed. It finally produced results. 3 more officers charged. Evidence directly traceable to questions he was asking. If he had lived to complete the investigation himself, it might have stopped the corruption years ago. But at least now his work is being finished." Sarah felt tears she had not cried in years threatening to surface, forced them down through practiced control. Patterson had been dead for more than a decade, but his impact continued. His questions, his documentation, his refusal to ignore irregularities even when told to focus on assigned duties. That integrity had cost him his life, but it had also planted seeds that took years to germinate into accountability. He had not died for nothing, would not be forgotten. His name would be attached to reforms and convictions that made the system marginally better than it had been. Walking back to her car, Sarah thought about weight she carried, not just her own trauma and grief, but the collective burden of everyone whose stories she had learned, whose cases she had investigated, whose families she had helped find truth. The weight was enormous, sometimes felt crushing, but it was also distributed across network of people committed to same purpose. Connor, Angela, Marcus, the young graduate preparing for deployment, Patterson's parents, hundreds of others who refused to accept that silence was acceptable price for institutional protection. The weight was not something to be set down or escaped, was fundamental part of who she had become. The transformation from traumatized medic fleeing her past into someone who carried that past forward as tool for creating change. She would never be free of Kandahar, would never stop seeing Patterson's face or the faces of the others who died, would never stop feeling responsibility for the ones she could not save. But she had learned to transform that weight into purpose, to use the pain as motivation rather than letting it become paralysis. Her phone rang as she reached the parking lot. Hospital. Multiple casualties incoming from explosion at construction site. All hands needed. Sarah got in her car and drove toward Mercy General, toward the immediate work of treating injuries and saving lives, toward the other half of her identity that grounded her when the investigation work became too heavy. She would spend the next 12 hours in the ER doing the medicine she loved. Then she would return to the cases and the fight and the ongoing work of accountability. This was her life now, the weight she carried, the purpose she had found, the transformation of survival into service. It was not the life she had imagined when she joined the military, not the quiet anonymity she had sought when she walked away from Kandahar, but it was meaningful in ways that hiding had never been. It was difficult and exhausting, and sometimes heartbreaking. But it mattered. The operators she helped, the families who finally got truth, the systemic changes that made betrayal slightly harder and accountability slightly more attainable. All of it mattered. Sarah Mitchell drove through Arlington traffic thinking about the young nurse she had been. The terrified medic in the stairwell deciding who got morphine and who got left behind. The broken veteran who spent 8 years trying to disappear. The person who answered a dying man's call sign and in doing so found her way back to herself. The journey had been longer and harder than she could have imagined, but she had emerged on the other side, transformed, not healed. Healing suggested return to previous state. She would never be who she was before Kandahar, but she had become someone new, someone stronger, someone committed to ensuring that the next generation of operators would not face the same betrayals that had nearly destroyed her. The weight would always be there. The memories, the loss, the knowledge of how badly institutions could fail the people who served them. But weight could be carried, could be transformed into foundation rather than burden, could become the ballast that kept her grounded when easier path would be to drift away from difficult truths. She carried the weight for Patterson, for Connor, for Marcus, for the young graduate about to deploy, for all the operators past and future who deserved better than silence and complicity. And in carrying that weight forward, in refusing to set it down or pretend it did not exist, in using it as motivation to fight for accountability and truth, she honored the promise made in a stairwell 10 years ago, the promise that their deaths would matter, that their service would be remembered honestly, that the system that betrayed them would be forced to change. It was the best she could offer, the only thing she had to give. And somehow, despite everything, despite the pain and the cost and the endless nature of the work, it was enough.